The House approved a rule change earlier this year that requires the economic effects of legislation to be included in a bill's official cost to the Treasury. It's called dynamic scoring. Reportedly, the rule change promises to make it somewhat easier for Republicans to advance bills such as an overhaul of the tax code, since the economic effects of such legislation would generate greater tax revenue and require less offsetting revenue to make up for cuts in income tax rates. Congressional Budget Office Director Keith Hall outlined the new rule at the Heritage Foundation today. This is an hour and 20 minutes.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask everyone here in-house to be so kind to check cell phones one last time to see that they have been turned off as we prepare to begin. And, of course, our Internet viewers and C-SPAN viewers are reminded that comments can be sent to us at any time, along with questions, to speaker@heritage.org, speaker@heritage.org. We will, of course, post the program on the Heritage homepage following today's presentations for your future reference. Hosting our discussion is David Burton, who is our Senior Fellow in Economic Policy in the Institute for Economic Freedom and Opportunity here at Heritage. He focuses on tax matters, security law, entitlements, and regulatory and administrative law issues. Before joining us here, he was a general counsel at the National Small Business Association. He has been chief financial officer and general counsel of the Alliance for Retirement Prosperity, and was also a partner at one time in the Argus Group, a public policy and government relations firm. His areas of expertise in finance and tax include posts that he has held as vice president for finance and general counsel of the New England Machinery, as well as manager of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Tax Policy Center. Please join me in welcoming David Burton. David?
Good afternoon. Our subject today is how the CBO will implement the new dynamic scoring rule recently adopted by Congress. And we have a genuinely excellent panel to address this subject. Now, the term dynamic scoring means scoring that takes into account the real-world economic effects of major proposed policy changes when estimating the budgetary effects of those policies. This contrasts with the past practice of using static scoring, that is, scoring which assumes that the economy will not change as a result of even major tax or other policy changes, even though we all know that they will. What it's really about is moving congressional scoring to what Bill Beach once called reality-based scoring, making sure that the scores used by policymakers are accurate, or at least as accurate as we can make them, rather than knowingly using factually incorrect scores that sometimes even get the sign wrong. I'll never forget when Senator Packwood in the 1980s asked the Joint Committee on Taxation to score a 100% tax on incomes over $200,000. And the JCT came back with an estimate that said such a tax proposal would raise hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, in reality, of course, there are only two tax rates that will raise no revenue, a zero tax rate and a 100% tax rate. So such a proposal would have really lost hundreds of billions of dollars. For the first time, both the CBO and JCT must conduct dynamic scores. House Rule 13.8 requires it, and so does Section 3112 of the concurrent resolution for the fiscal year 2016 budget, adopted by both the House and the Senate. In relevant part, the concurrent resolution reads, quote, during the 114th Congress, any estimate provided by the Congressional Budget Office under Section 402 of the Budget Act or by the Joint Committee on Taxation for major legislation considered in the House of Representatives or the Senate shall, to the greatest extent practical, incorporate the budgetary effects of changes in economic output, employment, capital stock, and other macroeconomic variables resulting from such major legislation. Now, major legislation in the concurrent budget resolution basically is defined as 1/4% of GDP, which is roughly $45 billion in gross budgetary effects. Or a major legislation can be designated as such by the chairman of either the budget committees or one of the tax rating committees. Now, the Heritage Foundation has been promoting dynamic scoring for a very long time, particularly with respect to tax policy scoring. This is because dynamic scoring, properly implemented, will enable policymakers to better understand the economic impact of the proposed policies and make achieving pro-growth economic policies less difficult. The earliest reference I could find on our website was a 1996 paper by Dan Mitchell, although I know that Heritage has been active on these issues long before that. In 2005, Heritage published a book on the subject called The Secret Chamber of the Public Square: What Can Be Done to Make Tax Analysis and Revenue Estimation More Transparent and Accurate. I collaborated with Bill Beach and Dan Mastromarco to edit that volume. Most of what's in it, unfortunately, is still highly relevant today. Regarding tax scoring, there's relatively little disagreement about the underlying economics of the macroeconomic impact of tax policy changes, but there is significant differences about the magnitude of the effects. The primary risk in tax is that JCT will systematically underestimate the growth effects of good or bad tax policy. With respect to spending, there is, in my judgment, significant disagreement in certain respects about the economic impact of spending policies. Issues include whether Keynesian-type stimulus effects are real or whether spending generally has a negative economic impact, Ricardo equivalence, the neoclassical growth effects or rate of return analysis with respect to infrastructure and human capital enhancing expenditures such as education and job training, and lastly, incentive effects, for example, the impact of phase-outs in means-tested programs or disability programs or unemployment insurance and the like. Our panel today is first rate. First, we're going to have Andy Morton with who's the chief economist with the House Budget Committee, then Bill Beach, and they're basically going to tell us about how we got to where we are and a few other things. Then we're very pleased to have the CBO Director Keith Hall, and finally Curtis Dubé, our Senior Research Fellow, will speak. Now, let me just take 1 second and introduce very briefly each of the four speakers, and then we'll get immediately to the program. Keith Hall has been the director of the Congressional Budget Office since April 1st of this year. Previously, he was a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and before that, a commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. From 2005 to 2008, he served as chief economist for the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Dr. Andy Morton is the chief economist of the House Budget Committee. He served as a senior economist in the Agriculture Department, on the staff of the CFTC, as the chief economist of the Senate Agriculture Committee, and as an analyst at the CBO. Dr. Beach is chief economist of the Senate Budget Committee. Previously, for 15 years, he was the director of the Center for Data Analysis here at the Heritage Foundation. He has also served as president of the Institute for Humane Studies and as senior economist at Sprint. I've known Bill longer than either of us would care to admit, and he's a fine economist and a true friend of economic liberty. Curtis Dubé is a research fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. The primary focus of his research is tax policy, and previously he was a senior economist at PricewaterhouseCoopers and the Tax Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Andy Morton.
It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm going to just kind of briefly make a few comments briefly on main areas to help set up this topic. Provide a little bit of background on the new macroeconomic scoring rule in the 2016 budget resolution conference agreement. And not too much, but maybe a few comments, thoughts on how this rule is likely to work to play out going forward. So in terms of background, So I started out in my professional career following my doctorate at CBO and working on cost estimates in the agricultural policy area. So I have a bit of a background, certainly when it comes to conventional scoring. So let me start out by a little technical background in this area. So CBO, and I think JCT as well, they have for years included behavioral responses in their conventional cost estimates. Now, at the microeconomic level, or in some cases, the market level, when they score spending and tax-related legislative proposals. So on the spending side, just as an example, CBO estimates how farmers might change their crop production decisions if the government changes farm income support levels or crop insurance subsidies, that type of policy lever. On the tax side, JCT has for years estimated how individuals or businesses will change their behavior at the microeconomic level in response to changes in tax rates and other tax-related parameters. However, these conventional estimates, as David mentioned, they also assume, very importantly, that the overall level of economic activity, typically measured by gross domestic product, does not change. So that is, the conventional scoring approach assumes that the overall size of the economy does not change due to legislation that's in front of the Congress. Now, as David also mentioned, I think most of us, if not all of us, would intuitively agree at least that major legislation can and almost certainly would affect the general economy. Historically, though, we haven't incorporated dynamic scoring, or as we like to say, Dr. Price, my boss, likes to say macroeconomic scoring. Historically, we haven't done that for proposed legislation for the most part. There have been concerns, I think it's fair to say, about the technical difficulty of doing this kind of analysis, the appropriate models to use, and even if you agree on the model, the appropriate magnitude for key parameters that are necessary to make this kind of analysis. However, I would say, and I was chatting with John Taylor about this after our hearing today at the House Budget Committee, I think it's fair to say that the economics profession as a whole has greatly advanced its capability in this area, its modeling capability, its analytical capability generally. And I think CBO and JCT have also been part of that. And particularly, at least in the case of CBO, I follow CBO for the work that I do most closely, and we have others that work more directly on tax policy. But I think CBO has taken a step forward as well in recent years, particularly when it comes to longer run economic modeling. In fact, in recent years, CBO has put into practice this enhanced capability. In certain instances, it's produced macroeconomic analyses with budgetary feedbacks associated of the president's budget, illustrative fiscal policy scenarios, and also more recently, the fiscal plans envisioned by the House and Senate budget resolutions, both the House budget last year and the House and Senate budgets in this year's resolution, and also the conference agreement, and have publicly released those on CBO's website. Now, as David mentioned, CBO, however, has generally not performed macroeconomic scoring of proposed legislation. Now, the major exception to that convention in recent years, of course, has been CBO's what I would call a partial macroeconomic score of the Senate immigration bill. But pursuant to a House rule that was in place through the 113th Congress, the Joint Tax Committee, JCT, has provided on a supplemental basis macroeconomic analyses to the extent practicable, again, of each of the Ways and Means Committee reported tax bills as supplemental information to their official conventional-based cost estimate. That's been going on for a number of years. So JCT has gotten quite a bit of experience under its belt, I would say, in the area of doing this for proposed legislation, this type of analysis. House Budget Committee Chairman Price, my boss, has been interested in macroeconomic scoring for a number of years, and in my view, has been a leader on this issue, as well as have been a number of other Republican members in the House. Dr. Price's Pro-Growth Budgeting Act, which the House passed in 2014, would have extended the JCT supplemental information analysis to direct spending and tax legislation generally, and would have also provided for not only macroeconomic-based estimates through the 10-year window, but also into subsequent decades beyond the 10-year window. Dr. Price's bill also, it set a marker in that there were concerns raised in the House early on this. How are we going to do this in an operational, a practical way? Are we going to be doing dynamic scoring or macroeconomic scoring for every bill as it comes through? And CBO and JCT do tell us that it does take more time to do those types of estimates. We're going to do this for every bill. Dr. Price's approach, of course, his approach at the time in his bill back in the previous Congress was to provide supplemental information, and particularly for major legislation. So he defined major legislation for the purpose of macroeconomic scoring requirement as having a gross budgetary effect, conventionally measured, on GDP of at least 0.25% of GDP in any year of the 10-year window. That actually, I think, elements of Dr. Price's bill, as it has turned out and played out in the House, they have become important elements of what the House did in January in the new Congress. The House decided with this new Congress that with the capability having advanced, with getting more experience with both this kind of analysis with both JCT and CBO, the time had come, the logical next step, and to do these estimates more accurately for major legislation, to require this for major legislation for both direct spending and revenue legislation. So that's what the House built into its rules package at the beginning of this new Congress. And then the budget resolution came along. Bill and I worked on this provision a great deal. And I think it's fair to say that there are some differences. I won't go into the weeds on this right now, but there are some slight differences. But the budget resolution provision is very similar to the House rule, and the important thing is it will apply in the Senate as well as the House. Now, I'll let Bill address how exactly that's going to work out in the Senate. It is going to be used in the House for official scoring when the time comes with respect to major legislation. Now, as far as how will the rule work going forward, a couple of things to say on that ground. First of all, we have Dr. Hall here, so I think I'm going to leave most of that to him. But I will say we don't know, we haven't yet tested this new provision in practice with a specific piece of legislation. I think that's going to happen in the fairly near future. I certainly can tell you that preparations are being made at JCT, at CBO, and we're watching this very carefully. I think in both of our budget committees in both chambers. There are a couple of issues in terms of getting ready to roll this out that I'll briefly touch on in terms of quantifying the macroeconomic effects of a piece of major legislation. I suspect that, in fact, there already has been, and I think there's going to be a great deal of discussion about what are the appropriate models to use, and I think there's going to be a striving to determine what are the consensus estimates for the magnitudes of the key estimating parameters. That's very much in progress. In terms of display issues, that's going to be important as well. How will these estimates be displayed for the Congress? CBO and JCT will need to provide estimates of the bill's impact on outlays, revenues, and deficits in the applicable years, inclusive of macroeconomic effects. So yes, we're going to want to look at the pieces, but we're going to need to know the bottom line in terms of each of those major budgetary aggregates, and they're going to need to be point estimates because that's essential in the way that the Congress does its scoring for legislation. I think JCT is already off to a very good start, as they have been doing this work on a supplemental basis for a number of years. I think CBO is off to a very good start as well, and I want to commend them for being very transparent in how they're proceeding with this, and look forward to hearing more.
Thanks, Andy. And Andy Morton and indeed all of his colleagues have been great partners in this experiment. I would like to thank all of you economists for being here in the audience today. Those of you who are not economists are very much in the position of one of the students of Wesley, Clare Mitchell, a famous economist who taught the history of economic doctrine at Columbia University roughly in the 1910s and 20s. And the student was having a very difficult time with this subject. You're reading Ricardo and endless 19th century economists who can't write, and came up to Wesley Clare Mitchell after one of the most tedious lectures ever, lasting hours, I would assume, and said, "Dr. Mitchell, how can you stand this topic? This is just awful." And Mitchell looked at the student and said, "I have a very high tolerance for this topic." So I hope you have a very high tolerance for this topic this afternoon, because from the weed tops, I am going to go into the weed bottoms. I think it's important that one of us speak about the mechanics. And these remarks are intended, directed at Keith and his colleagues, but they're intended not to be, in a sense, a cookbook for them, but based on the experience that we acquired here at the Heritage Foundation and other organizations outside of government over the years in scoring, I thought it would be useful to say a few things. So the implementation of macroeconomic scoring, which we also call honest accounting, and some other people call dynamic scoring, so there's many terms for this, constitutes a major enhancement in the scoring practices of the CBO and the Joint Committee. During the pendency of the current budget resolution, CBO will be asked to augment its current conventional scoring practice for certain legislation with a dynamic score. Moreover, it will do so in real legislative time. That is, its macroeconomic scores will not be research products. Rather, they will be cost estimates produced in time for the consideration of legislation. This scoring technique also qualifies as major because of how it will change established conventional scoring operations and models. That's a crucial point, in my view. Macroeconomic scoring is not an additional costing technique in the sense that building a new addition to a house adds to the total square feet of the dwelling. Rather, it is an improvement to CBO's scoring program, much like installing a new and more powerful engine into an automobile, improves the car's performance. And finally, the implementation of macroeconomic scoring constitutes a major initiative for CBO because of the controversy surrounding it. This controversy probably stems in part from the claims of some tax reform advocates that macroeconomic scoring will automatically reduce all costs of all tax reforms. It is likewise probably stems from the claims of some who oppose tax rate reductions, that it is a technique designed to justify tax cuts for high-income taxpayers. In my view, neither of those are true. CBO's challenge will be to implement this scoring technique while correcting such expectations and puncturing myths. So let me develop a couple of these points in the next 6 or so minutes. Let me first talk about routine macroeconomic scoring. CBO has long maintained macroeconomic models and employed analysts with extensive training in macroeconomics to run these models. So they have a good foundation. Indeed, the office has an entire division, macroeconomic analysis division, devoted to the macroeconomic problems that CBO needs to solve. Baseline economic forecasts and projections are the biggest ones, and they're used in the all-important CBO spending and revenue baseline that Andy and I work with. They also analyze, as Andy said, the President's annual budget submission, and they answer a number of macroeconomic questions that arise during the legislative session. Indeed, CBO often points to its analysis of the Senate's recent comprehensive immigration reform legislation, S770, as an example of its capabilities in the macro scoring realm. Over the course of 6 weeks, CBO successfully applied its macro models to conventional cost estimates of immigration legislation and produced a final cost estimate that incorporated economic feedback. And so, in essence, we have track record. Despite this success and the capacity it demonstrated to create macroeconomic scores, research products like the Office's immigration work or recent analysis of the minimum wage increases tell us little, actually, about CBO's ability to routinely produce macroeconomic scores. Difference between research and routine. While routine production of such scores clearly requires the macro models CBO used to produce immigration and minimum wage estimates, several other elements need to be in place to support in-time production of macro scores. Man, we are really in the weeds now, right? If any of you want to leave the room, just hold your hand up. So let me mention two. One, model selection. In a research setting, analysts will spend a lot of time determining the appropriate model to use for the particular question being posed from among many possible, sometimes competing models. In routine dynamic scoring, however, which comes at you in rapid succession, it is best to settle on a couple of models that are capable of addressing a wide variety of legislative proposals, and to use those models for most, if not all, of your scoring projects. Secondly, focus on science and mechanics. Whatever model is employed for routine work, it should carefully reflect the mainstream economic thinking and be sufficiently detailed to handle a widely diverse set of assumptions. So you have to have a model that reflects the science that's in the mainstream and a big model to handle all the projects to be thrown at it. That's hard to get. The goal of reflecting the mainstream of economic thinking builds into the maintenance of scoring models the discipline of constantly updating the model's specifications to reflect the evolving views of academic economists. So you keep your eye on the science in order that your model's always sharp, at the edge, at the correct edge. That keeps the modeling team's focus on the economic science on which the model is built. Second point, integration of models. So model selection is difficult, but integration of models is also something you need to be thinking about. There exists a deep misunderstanding among many who have followed the debate and adoption of macroeconomic scoring that it creates a second score to accompany the current conventional score. Or worse, that it requires CBO and JCT to produce a range of macroeconomic scores, each of which would be produced by a separate macroeconomic model. Neither of these are envisioned or supported by the scoring rule in the joint resolution. We can't have two scores on the floor when we're involved with legislative debate. We have one score. The introduction of routine macroeconomic scoring allows additional information to enter into the creation of the CBO or JCT final score of major legislation. It is an enhancement of the current scoring practice, not a competing or a new layer on current practice. It corrects an information bias in current scoring, which would remain deficient without macro modeling. And that information is about the general economy. So when you don't include changes in the size and shape of the general economy, the pace, you're not biased against doing that. You're creating a bias because you're not including all available information. I'm not saying they're biased. We all use bias in a kind of a pejorative sense. It's like if you walked around with your left eye closed, you wouldn't be getting all the information that you could. And now we're going to have both eyes open. That said, the new scoring rule not only enhances current scoring practice, but it also reshapes some aspects of conventional modeling too. Let me just cite one aspect. The conventional models that Andy talked about frequently contain data and equations designed to capture how policy change might directly or indirectly affect the behavior of individuals and organizations. So you might have a labor model that it's a conventional model that would have things like, well, if taxes rise, will people work more or less? It's called the tax elasticity of labor effort. Almost all of these feeder models that feed into the macro model will contain behavioral equations, parameters or assumptions, that are essential for the accurate analysis of policy change. They have to have them. It would be an error, however, to leave those parameters or assumptions in the underlying feeder models untouched once they start to interact with the macro models. The macro model may have a labor force elasticity in it. The micro model may have a labor force elasticity in it. Do you count them both? Or do you integrate? Do you integrate the two? And so not only are you putting a new modeling practice in place, you're changing your underlying or existing modeling practice. It's a comprehensive field adjustment that occurs because we're not adding a new scoring technique, we're changing the existing scoring technique. And finally, let me just say a word about communication and display. Policymakers and the general public look to the CBO for point cost estimates. Even though there's widespread recognition that the conventional estimating models produce equally legitimate estimates depending upon the application of different and valid behavioral assumptions. Even so, CBO has chosen to produce point estimates in nearly all of its work of conventional modeling. Okay, let me just translate that. CBO produces point estimates all the time. If you're on the CBO website, you're just seeing one after another after another. And Keith won't tell you today, but I bet you he would tell you if you asked him privately. I really put him on the spot there. There may be more than just one answer to those models, but they have to choose one. So that's a display issue. So let me just conclude with that point. Back in 1975, the CBO was created in the 1974 Budget and Impoundment Act, Budget Control and Impoundment Act. So in 1975, Alice Rivlin and her colleagues began to put together the conventional models. And they had discussions with the Hill, they had discussion with economists like me and Andy on the Hill. There were oversight hearings, there was all this interaction that occurred before the models, which we now accept, they're great, were finally settled. We're at that same point right now. We're not, again, just adding on, creating a new set of models out there. We're changing the core practice of CBO and the Joint Committee. The core practice is changing. So be patient with us. We haven't done any scoring yet. That's not a failure. The failure would be to do this too quickly and to do it wrong.
Thank you, Bill. Dr. Hall. There's the remote there.
All right, is that slide actually up? Yeah, okay, great. Let me start by saying these slides are already up on the CBO website, so you can get them there.
Turn that so you can see them.
I can. This is close enough. I think. Well, I'll try. At the bottom there is a link. We've set up a little spot on our website with all our papers and such on dynamic scoring. So if you want to see some of the work we've done, the background work, you can see that. All right, let me start by. All right, probably have to turn it on first. Let's see. Well. The computer is locked up. Ah, okay. Just as well. I'll go without the slides. The first point about scoring at CBO, let me mention one thing, and this is the issue of doing a macroeconomic effects analysis, which is how CBO refers to a dynamic analysis. Is in terms of scoring, we produce more than 600 formal cost estimates a year at CBO. And we produce between 5,000 and 6,000 informal cost estimates, right? So first of all, using dynamic scoring in all those is not possible. It takes too much time. And anyway, the effects are probably too small to show up on the dynamic scoring in any event. One of the important aspects about the budget resolution, a very important part, is that it sets the requirement up for things that are fairly large. That 0.25% of GDP, that works out to be about $45 billion in budgetary effect in a year. All right, that's a good standard for two reasons. All right, one is we can't do this every time, so we need to pick the big ones. But the second thing is the dynamic effects are probably only going to be significant on the big ones anyway. So that works out just fine. And at this level, I don't know, I haven't done an exact count, but we probably had 3, 4, 5 estimates last year that hit this criteria. So it's not going to be a lot of work. And also, any designation by one of the chairmen of the budget committees can ask us to do a dynamic analysis. Okay. All right. Well, it's up, but it's not.
Still not behaving?
Still not behaving. Oh, well.
Just do it the old way.
Yeah. Well, the slides will be available. I don't really need the slides.
Okay.
Use your hands.
My hands, okay. Let me talk in general about my view of the macroeconomic analysis. Right. First of all, it's really not controversial in the economic profession that there are dynamic effects, right, from either spending or taxes. That's not controversial. The tricky part is the accuracy. And let me give you an idea from my perspective. I spent some time in the statistical agencies. At BLS, I spent some time at Commerce. And when you estimate a piece of statistical data, when you're estimating GDP, there are two things you're looking for. One is you're looking for an estimate that's unbiased. So your revisions go up as much as they go down once you get more complete data. And the other is accuracy. You want the revisions to be small. With a dynamic scoring, in my view, you've got two ways of looking at it. I think you've got a similar sort of analysis with it. If you know there are likely to be dynamic effects, and you assume the dynamic effects are zero, you're introducing bias into an estimate, right? But by introducing dynamic scoring and getting something that hopefully is less bias, you may introduce more error, more uncertainty in your estimate. And that's a legitimate trade-off to worry about. Right, you really can't worry. You can make a decision that you don't want to have a dynamic analysis because it introduces too much error. You can decide that you're willing to accept a little bit more uncertainty if you get something that's less bias. Right, so it's a reasonable thing to think about CBO at one time not doing dynamic scoring because in some sense, and now starting to do it because now hopefully we'll get something that's got more of it's got less bias in it. Second thing I want to say about CBO is macroeconomic effects are not new to CBO. Right, we've been doing them for several years. We've been developing the models for 7 years. To a large degree, we've got our act down in terms of our workhorse models. Literally yesterday, we produced our latest long-term budget outlook. That used our dynamic model. We looked at the budget outlook over 25 years. Part of that was looking at the macroeconomic effects. And I can tell you in that particular estimate, we took into account the macroeconomic effects of a rising deficit, increased taxes on wages, the effect on the labor market, increased number of transfers, and we took into account a decrease in investment, all out of the budget forecast going forward. So we took all those things into account. The one that dominated was the increase in the deficit in the long-term budget outlook, but all those things were part of the dynamic scoring. It's been routinely in the analysis of the president's budget. It will be, and as somebody, both you guys, I think, already mentioned the immigration bill. It's an important part of the immigration bill, of course, because you had something that changed your labor supply. You just can't ignore dynamic effects if your labor supply is changing. So that was an important thing to include. One of the things I think is really important about starting in with a dynamic macroeconomic effects analysis is transparency. We've now had a couple of presentations. If you look at this presentation, I've got some detail in here. I'll talk about the detail as well as we go. We actually had one of our meeting of our economic advisory panel on Friday. We made a presentation on macroeconomic analysis. So we talked about the models we'd use. We told them in some detail. We talked to them about the parameter values in the models. And we got some feedback from them, too, about how we were going to talk about the results when we did the results. The idea being asking economists to understand this work, what sort of transparency would help them understand what we're doing. And in my mind, the early role of transparency for sure for us is if we produce a score and use a dynamic analysis, it's not helpful to us if you say, oh, the score's too high or it's too low. We want you to tell us which parameter was wrong. Are we using a description of the labor market that's too responsive or not responsive enough? Are we using the right model? So we want stuff that actually can help us improve things in the future. And it does two things, I think, for us. One, it helps with the credibility. Right? This stuff can be a black box unless you know exactly what kind of model is being used, the parameter values. But the second thing is it helps you criticize us in helpful ways. And one of the things that we certainly need to think about is improving this over time, getting our act together, making estimates, seeing how we're doing, and actually taking criticism when criticism is needed. The estimates in particular, we spend a lot of time now looking at labor markets. Right, because one of the most important dynamic effects is what happens to labor markets. If you all recall, one of the things that we did on the ACA was we found some results where the labor market hours worked would decline by 1.5% to 2%. Right, with the ACA. Well, what does that tell you about the dynamic effects of the ACA? If you have a declining labor market, that means it's going to be a drag on economic growth. So you know which direction, sort of where the dynamic effects are going to be on something like that. But other things, of course, the other effects are there. We're doing some work now. We've done a lot of work on the labor supply. We're actually doing some work on the effects of government investment, federal investment. So one of the things that's going to do is that's going to help inform us on the spending side of things, on the dynamic analysis part. At some point, we'll release that, and we'll have some estimates in there, and folks will get an idea of what that looks like. In terms of the actual modeling, the trouble with dynamic modeling is it's obvious, right? Any kind of modeling, but dynamic modeling in particular. The economy is really complex, right? And whatever model you use, it's too simple to really capture what's going to really happen with precision in the economy, right? But if you can make an estimate, right, if you can base it on empirical work, then you've got some value. Our two workhorse models are one is a solo type growth model, and the other is a life cycle growth model. Right? The first one, the solo type growth model, is probably going to be our workhorse because it's got enough. It's complex enough, but it's also simple enough, so it's something we could use fairly quickly. And both these models are forecasting not just output, they're forecasting potential output. Right? So in determining potential output, the amount and quality of labor and capital both are important, right? Because it affects work, savings, and investment. Productivity is important. Federal investment impacts productivity, which impacts the macro model. And the amount of national savings is important, which is depends in part on federal borrowing. All those things are in these models. The solo type growth model, first of all, as I say, it's based on real empirical data. It's based on elasticities, where we're looking at the impact of previous changes in policy, right? Previous changes on economic variables. And so it assumes that people base their decisions about working and saving primarily on current economic conditions and current policies. All right, and that's it. So in a sense, it's a little more short-sighted than other models. But in a way, anticipation of future policies is in there in a general way, because within the elasticities in the past, when taxes change, people change their expectations, and that's implicitly in those elasticity estimates, right? But anticipation of future policies is not explicitly in the model, it's just in there in a general way in the elasticities. This is what makes it a bit easier to operate. The second model is a life cycle growth model. Some people call it an overlapping generations model, right? This differs only in that it explicitly takes into account explicit expectations about future economic conditions. Right? Now, we worked on actually making these models so they're actually consistent with each other. We would likely not run the life cycle growth model without first looking at the solo model, to be honest. But we've made some effort to make the parameters consistent. The tricky part about the life cycle growth model is it goes on forever, right? So what happens to expectations if people see the federal budget debt going on to infinity forever? Right? Then their expectation is it's not sustainable, and you've got a problem. The model won't even solve under those circumstances. So what's important about the model is you have to have some specification of future fiscal policies in particular that put the federal debt on a sustainable path. Right, so you got to make an assumption about policy in here. And the notion, I mean, the basic logic of households won't hold government bonds that expect the bonds are going to be worthless someday. Sort of a way to look at it. Now, we've actually had pretty good luck using this model, and it turns out in practice, when we look at this sort of future fiscal policies, if we put them enough in the future, then it doesn't matter so much what the policy is. The model solves, and the results aren't that sensitive to the exact policies. In other words, you don't have to sort of figure out how Congress is going to solve the debt. Exactly. A number of ways you can do it as long as you put it out maybe 25 years in the future. The difference between these two models. The life cycle growth model is going to be important on things that have clear future expectations involved. Social Security. We'd never use just the solo type growth model with Social Security because Social Security is so far in the future that it's really important to look at explicit expectations about future economic conditions. So we'd likely bring in this life cycle growth model in instances like that. Things where I'd say where clearly those things are involved. And if my slides were working, I could show you the elasticities, some of the elasticities that we're using. And not that I expect these to necessarily mean much to you, but the point is we're going to be transparent about it. You can see these elasticities. I can tell you when we talked to our economic advisory panel, we had some debate about were the values of the statistics fair, right? And that's the sort of debate that we want. We want to be sure that we get that right and it's defendable. And our goal is there may be a range of values, but we're going to give a point estimate. We're going to give something that's consistent with the view of the profession. And we're going to give you some idea of the uncertainty involved. Sometimes it's a problem of unknown unknowns, right? So how do you do standard error? How do you do uncertainty there? Well, one of the ways you do it is what we did with the long-term budget outlook and what we released yesterday. Some of the important variables are things like productivity. Well, we look back at the history of productivity growth, and we know productivity growth historically has certain range to it. Well, we ran the model through that range. We had a point estimate that we used. We ran it at the high end, at the low end, give you an idea how that affected the output. Right, so it's not a standard error, but it does give you an idea of historically how much variation there has been in productivity, how that affects our forecast. You can do it for a number of things like that, and that gives you some idea of what we've got here. And I think especially the presentation and how we do this is going to evolve over time. It takes a little time to do this. There's a very important language that we actually asked them to add, and they were kind enough to add. We're supposed to do work on anything that has a gross budgetary effect of 0.25% of GDP, et cetera. Well, there's some great language, to the extent practicable. Right. That sometimes there may be stuff where we just can't do it. And to be honest, sometimes we may find there's just not that big of an effect. We could put it in there, but again, it sort of depends on what it is. We need to make some distinctions between what kinds of policies are in place, get elasticities that maybe are crafted better to particular types of tax changes, particular types of spending changes. But I can tell you something where maybe in the near future where I have no idea how we're going to do. Trade Promotion Authority is up. Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? If that becomes a bill, if we actually get asked to dynamically score that, we don't have any trade models, let alone dynamic impact of trade models. So that's a challenge, and that's one of my points too here about that. We've got our workhorse models, but sometimes you need something more. Sometimes the models aren't enough. So that's going to be a challenge for us. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. Curtis?
Thanks. It's a real honor to be up here with such an august panel. And as David alluded to in the introduction, Heritage has been working on and towards dynamic scoring for a really long time, and we continue that work. But all of us who work on it today stand on the shoulders of Bill, who really set that up. You did the first one in 1996, right? The first dynamic analysis here, and they really kept at it at CDA for about 20 years, and we continue that work. And we're really excited to see the rule in the budget this year because this is a really big step forward. One of the keys to modeling is that you get better at it the more you do it. So it's really important that CBO and JCT do the modeling, because they'll learn more and more each time they do it. If you go back to last year, the JCT scored the tax reform proposal that then Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Dave Camp, put together. And I think they learned an awful lot when they did that. And I think they did a pretty good job, considering it was really the first big dynamic score they'd done in a really long time. And I think the next time that they scored tax reform, they'll do an even better job. So it's that feedback that helps you get better and better the more you do it. But transparency is also a big factor. If you put the score out, you put them out often, and you're transparent about what you do, you can get feedback from the academic community and the community that really cares about this. And it's an iterative process, and we'll get better and better at it, and will help with getting that point estimate that Bill talked about. From a higher level, there's a lot of talk in policymaking today about being pro-science and anti-science. I think this plays into it. This is a pro-science thing. We know we have the technology. We know how to use it. It's there, and we should be doing it. We just need to use it more and to show that it can be done. And I think that will happen as we advance and we do more and more of these dynamic scores. It is certainly a pro-science, and it's certainly an advancement because we know that static estimates are wrong. We know that certain bills do have effects on the macroeconomy. And when we do a status score, we're denying that. So a dynamic score gets us a more accurate, a better score. No score is ever going to be at 100% right on, but we know we're moving in the right direction. And so that's why I think it's just a huge thing that Bill and Andy have helped put together, and that Dr. Hall is going to help implement, and we can keep building on it going forward. And eventually we'll get to a place where dynamic scoring and static scoring, it's not really a debate anymore. Everything is just going to be dynamically scored. Thank you.
All right, we have time for some questions. Please use the microphone for the benefit of those watching over the internet, and identify yourself and your institutional affiliations. Question. Here.
Hi, I'm Kevin Dyer-Rotner from the Heritage Foundation. The question is for Dr. Hall. I was just wondering if any of these dynamic models have been used to, say, backtest previous legislation, such as, for example, the Kemp-Roth tax cuts of the early 1980s and the dynamic effects of that, and if you were able to reproduce, whatever subsequently occurred.
Yeah, to my knowledge, we haven't done that, but I do think that's an interesting idea. It's always hard. Any sort of economic forecasting is difficult. Right, we mess up on the short-term forecast all the time, just like everybody else does. So here we're talking about a long-term forecast. It's difficult, and it's hard to know what went wrong in a forecast like it. But I do think that would be informative. One of the issues for us is how much time we can take to do a backcast like that. But I think that's an interesting idea.
Well, you obviously wouldn't be able to forecast up to, like, say, 30 years from the fact, but maybe 5, 10 years into the future, you could see some interesting results.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I agree.
David, I wonder if I could say a quick word on that. Steve Enton, who's in the audience today, sitting over there, and one of the great pioneers in this whole area of costing dynamic analysis and so forth, he and I were privileged to be on a design team with when the JCT was putting together the MEG model, which is their dynamic model. And Steve, if memory serves me right, they actually did a backcasting exercise, and I think that they looked at the 2001 Tax Act, or maybe the 1990s, something in the 1990s. It'd be interesting, Keith, for you to ask Pam Mumau or Tom over there to pull that study out, and it was very enlightening to us as we were putting together the specifications of the MEG model.
Over here.
Bill Hoagland with the Bipartisan Policy. I guess this is a question for, first of all, thank the panel. Thank you all for your presentation. I guess this is a question for Bill. I'm looking at the report. It's been bothering me.
Is that mic on?
In the report language, it says, in the Senate, these estimates would be provided for informational purposes only. Can you clarify how this is going to work? If it's only for informational purposes only in the Senate, but it's for actual scoring as Andy has outlined in the House?
Sure, that's a great question. We're often asked that question. There are differences, as you know, Bill, more than perhaps anyone else sitting in this auditorium today, between the rules of the House and the rules of the Senate. And so, not to get anybody disturbed about that difference, but that is the difference. In fact, there is even a difference between the House and Senate as to who is the upper body. And clearly, the Constitution says that the Senate is the upper body, but we have that is a difference of opinion. So, in the rules of the Senate, we have a predilection against more than one cost estimate being on the floor at any one time. And so, we are working with all of the elements in the Senate, the parliamentarian, everyone else, to explore how we can bring this new scoring into the Senate rules. More than anything else, that will be dependent upon how we eventually get the CBO scoring table done. And, because that will give us an idea of what is that score. So we'll have to kind of put that question off to the side rail for a while. It is a developing discussion, and well, we aren't changing the rules of the Senate. We would accommodate ourselves within the rules of the Senate.
But the concurrent budget resolution contains mandatory language. It's not merely advisory, and the Senate agreed to that.
Right. So there are in the rules of the Senate various rules about points of order, about we've got a lot of complexity there when it comes to scoring, and so we need to work this into that, and we need to find we need to find a path into that, and so I'm not particularly disturbed as we were working our way through the budget resolution. We weren't ready or even up to getting all of that done while we were debating a budget resolution. I don't think that's even the appropriate place for that to be done. So I would just watch that develop, and maybe by the time we are a few months in from here, we'll have some news on that front. We'll just see how it's being done. Having said all of that, let me just point out in a more general sense that any macroeconomic score that comes out of CBO will, whether it's official score, whether it's informational, whether it's guidance, whatever, is going to result in a better policy debate, don't you think? Yeah, and so I can't imagine that it wouldn't improve. It would improve things. So we'll just all watch to see how that develops, Bill. But I hope that addresses your question.
This gentleman.
Hi, Luca Toni, Chile Tax Notes. This has been very, very interesting. This one's for Dr. Beach, actually following up on Bill's question. I couldn't find the specifying language for the Senate, for informational purposes only in the actual, not of the conference report, but of the actual text of the budget. Does that is the same restriction not in the actual legislative text, or can you explain that a little?
Well, if I had my lawyer here, I could probably help you out on that. But you're asking a question for an economist here. It's in there somewhere. It's like Prego.
Well, I do have an economist. I actually have an economist question too. Regarding the reporting and presentation issues that you talked about, and I'd love to hear Dr. Hall's thoughts on this. Obviously, you said that your intention, and I guess the intention of this project of increasing and kind of putting in place as the standard, the macroeconomic analysis, would be to have one score and have this replace the point estimate. So you wouldn't see what the conventional point estimate would be alongside this. You would just see this. And
well, that is yet to be. That's one of the design issues.
All right,
that's still coming up. We haven't quite crossed that bridge yet. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Hall, what do you think about that? Do you see value in continuing to present the conventional model outputs even if, say, this becomes the standard, dynamic scoring becomes the standard?
Yes, I think if it's up to us, we would produce the dynamic score, and it would also, somewhere in the document, have the conventional part and the macroeconomic effect part, just for understanding of the score and for understanding the uncertainty in what we've done.
If I could add just a brief thing.
Yeah, sure.
So I think from a transparency point of view, I think what Keith said right there makes a world of sense. I would just add that for, and Bill knows all about this, both bills, I should say, for official scoring purposes, when you're moving legislation forward, and the parliamentarian or the councils, whatever committee's involved, the rules committee, they need to see that point estimate. We're probably going to need, if we do these pieces in a macroeconomic score, we're also going to need the overall totals. It's basically just the summing up. So there's, to avoid confusion, frankly, for people who are, and particularly until this becomes more routine.
Other questions? This gentleman.
Jonathan Nicholson with Bloomberg BNA. I was a little bit confused on the life cycle growth model stuff, and I guess you have to have a point estimate. Most CBO scores are over 10 years. But if you put the solution as to how something is paid for, whether through increased taxes or a cut in spending 25 years out, does that undermine sort of the, if your score is for a point estimate over 10 years, but your closing solution is 25 years out, does that undermine the score kind of on a consistency basis?
Yeah, I think not. I think our goal has always tried to be sort of in the middle, sort of look for consensus and look for something in the middle. So in fact, if a particular score with a life cycle model, there's some impact of changing the policy back and forth, we'd pick something in the middle and maybe try to be transparent about the effects of the policy down the line.
Ma'am, did you have a question?
Lisa Garcia, FOIA Resource Center. Thank you so much for your remarks so far. My question touches on transparency, confusion, and also the dynamic nature of the scoring. Isn't it also the case that the administration is sort of creating its own analysis and competing with the numbers? You're all scientists, so you focus on the numbers, and you're so great about that. But I just wonder if you would talk a little bit about any pressures you feel to either manipulate or, are you feeling those pressures? And to the extent that it invites confusion when the administration comes up with its own scores based on behavioral economics that they say are very responsive, much more responsive in a dynamic manner. Thanks.
Well, I'll answer that with a story, which is always safer for me than to answer it directly. When we started to do dynamic analysis here at Heritage, our first project was to take a look at the 1993 Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, which many of you know as the 93 tax increases, or many of you others know as the one that saved the 90s, depending on your political perspective. And during the course of that, we discovered that President Clinton's Office of Management and Budget had used a dynamic model to take a look at the 1993 tax increases. We were very comforted by that, not knowing at the time that it was a controversial technique. But President Clinton just wanted to know what was going on. I have since learned that the White House and the Treasury have been leaders, but not well-known leaders, in developing dynamic techniques. So I think, to go back to something Curtis said, and perhaps even all of us have said, that the more this is done, the more differences there are, the more there's this controversy and the debate, the better the techniques will become. I think it's a scoring procedure which is here to stay, and we need to explore it thoroughly.
Anybody else? Okay. Next, this gentleman in the back. You can just hand the mic if it's easier.
Hi, I'm Hire Regal from the American Legislative Exchange Council. I was wondering if the states have adopted any dynamic scoring, or if the success on the federal level might spur states to do so.
Well, I know Bill can answer this question, but the answer is yes. But go ahead. You have more experience.
Well, in the book that was referred to by David Burton, there's a chapter in there on what the states do. When we wrote that chapter, which was in 2005, we found 10 states that used dynamic scoring, dynamic analysis, or dynamic input in forming their budgets or looking at their legislation. 2 states that did so were large states, New York and California. Since that time, Texas has also started that, with maybe more than 10 today. So yes, there's a laboratory out there, and there are states that have good practices, probably states that don't have pretty good practices, but there's some ground truth and experience on that front.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you guys so much. Caroline Wiles, Healthcare Leadership Council. I just had a quick clarification question about kind of the criteria for bills that are going to be under the dynamic scoring. So will your dynamic scoring include estimates beyond just like the general 10 years, or will it just kind of cap off at an estimate that's 10 years?
Oh, boy. Nobody wants to answer these questions. We use a 10-year budget window for almost all of our legislation. There's some exceptions. The joint resolution asks CBO to also give an opinion, a qualitative answer for the next 10 years. Next 20 years, actually. The next 20 years. CBO has from time to time given us, as they did yesterday, a long-term budget outlook that goes out, in this case, to 2040. So there's an answer to your question, which goes to routine, everyday budget work, and that would be probably the best thing to say, yes, a 10-year look. But there are lots of scores that come out, or not scores, or even just papers and research products that look beyond that period of time. I wouldn't. Again, models are limited. As Yogi Berra you were saying the day was Keith. He testified in front of our committee this morning. I think he said that all projections are suspect, especially those about the future. And this is a Yogi Berra thing. So that's probably a good thing to keep in mind. This is just to give policymakers a new piece of advice, not to give them a perfect prediction. Policymakers have a real hard time they have to make judgments, and so they need to see probable paths of consequences of going A or B or C. And so that's what models do. They give them the most likely outcome, but they are certainly not to be ever held to an account, especially for the long term, to give them perfectly accurate results.
It will matter a good deal about the context of what the bill is doing. So a tax and spending bill, 10 years is probably sufficient. But if you're making changes to Social Care and Medicare, you're going to want to see 20, 30 years out.
Yeah, I'd just say it also depends upon whether you're at near potential growth or not, right? Because the dynamic step is all about changing the potential part of the economy. If you're well below potential, then you've got to get to there first. So, for example, right now, the dynamic part may not add that much on a 10-year forecast because the economy is not at potential values.
Next question. This gentleman.
Thank you. Paul Krozak, CQ Roll Call. Dr. Morton, you had said that the dynamic scoring rule may be tested soon. Dr. Hall, you had said, you had mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So my question is, what upcoming legislation might qualify for this rule? And I guess a few examples would be repeal of the Affordable Care Act, a legislative response to the King v. Burwell decision, Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPA, highway reauthorization, and finally business tax reform. Any or all?
Well, Paul, that's why I said this. It may well be tested soon. I don't really know which, if any of those, may be the first or the second or if it'll be others. But, I suspect we'll get a test fairly soon, and, with relatively short order. That doesn't mean next week or the week after that, but, sometime relatively soon.
And we'll try to be ready.
Is it clear whether any or all of those would qualify?
Well, one of the considerations, too, is we can be asked to do a dynamic score even if it doesn't meet the criteria. So there's still some unknown in that respect.
Steve Enton.
Hi, Steve Enton, Tax Foundation. Dr. Hall, you mentioned that there's this trigger over which it has to be bigger than it, or you don't do it and you have thousands of things to do. Our model is a little simpler than some of the ones that you're running, and we're not trying to model quite as many things as you are, but whether I enter a 1 point change in the corporate rate, either up or down, or a 10% change in the corporate rate, up or down, the model runs just as fast either way, give or take a second or two, and I get an answer within a minute. Some tax cuts have changes in either direction, have enormous changes in deadweight losses and growth, and others have little effect or actually act perversely or more than pay for themselves, very few, but some. So I would like to know the difference between the ones that have a big effect on deadweight losses and others that simply don't seem to do much damage or don't do much good when you change them. If you're only looking at the big ones, you might have one big cut that does a little bit of good, given its type, and you may have a whole bunch of very small offsets, all of which have very big deadweight losses, and you really shouldn't be touching them. If you're not modeling the bad ones and you're only modeling the good one because the good one's big and the little cumulative ones are bad, it seems to me you're missing something. I think one of the very important things about modeling is you can give people the quality of the type of tax change they're recommending. And if you could at least group them into things that obviously do good or obviously do bad, and sort of scale back your estimate and get more information out or develop a model that runs faster. This information about what's good and what's bad could tend to get lost if they're all below the threshold, and I think that could result in a bill that turns out to be bad when the one big thing looks good. Witness 1986, I can get into that later, but I hope you can get a model that runs quickly enough to give the small tax cuts their due as well, or tax increases their due as well at some point, or voluntarily do it even if they're below the threshold.
Yeah, and of course, as I've said, we can be asked to as well. So, but right now, I know it's when we've done it, it's taken us a while to do it in a way that we're comfortable. But hopefully, we'll get faster at that.
That also raises a presentation issue. In effect, are you going to just have one aggregate score? Or are you going to disaggregate the dynamic effects of subsets of large legislation? And have you guys thought about that?
Well, we've asked the CBO to think about how they would show us the dynamic effects on outlays summed up in a bill, on revenues summed up in a bill, and on the deficit. Those are the three things in the joint resolution which we have asked them to produce. That clearly is of a kind of an informational, I don't know how that will fit in. If I remember correctly, looking at conventional scores, they usually sum up all the provisions and then give you a line for that, for the outlay portion. Sum up all the revenues, and if there are revenues in the bill. So we'll as we've answered several times this afternoon, we'll be waiting for CBO to work with us, Andy and myself, and people on the staffs that we work on, to develop those display elements. Again, we're at 1975. We're not where we are today on conventional scoring with respect to dynamic scoring. We need to really think thoughtfully through this, how we're going to display and how we're going to operate it.
Yes.
Salim Firth, Heritage Foundation. Thank you all for being here. A question for Dr. Hall, and very much in the weeds, as Bill would say. With outlays, when you look at, say, just the static effect of spending say $50 billion on research and $50 billion on pick your the most useless government thing that you can think of. I don't want to pick on anybody. So think of something useless versus something, say, very good research that's helpful and contributes to growth in industry, et cetera. From a static perspective, both of those cost $50 billion. The Treasury's writing checks, that leaves, and you have a deficit. From a dynamic point of view, the former kind is clearly better. We all sort of intuitively say, well, it's clearly better to spend on investments or things that aren't useless or things that don't do harm somehow. Does CBO have a way, or have you thought about developing ways to group or classify or evaluate types of outlays? It just seems to be a much harder problem than on the tax side, where on tax you're basically giving people their money back and they're going to do with it broadly the same things that they were doing before, just sort of all scaled up slightly. So I think that's probably the hardest question when I think about dynamically scoring things, and I'm curious what your response is.
You know, I agree, and that's the sort of thing I think that's part of experience with it, that we start to get comfortable with the sort of things that we're working on. And certainly on outlays, timing, something like investment timing is really important in a way that's not with taxes. So I think that's probably going to be an issue when we start doing sort of dynamic scoring and we start deciding what sort of timing the effect's going to come in. And if it's something that impacts productivity, well, yeah, that's out in the future a little bit. So that's going to be an issue.
All right, we have time for one or two more questions, and that's it. David?
I'm David Addington with Heritage Foundation. First, for the 3 PhDs on the panel, thank you all for your service to the country. We all appreciate it and benefit from it. Dr. Hall, the question I wanted to ask you relates to the words that you had put in the concurrent budget resolution. I wanted to be sure, if you can assure us, that CBO will interpret the words to the extent practicable in a professional sense. Something may not be practicable because you don't have the models that would accomplish it, or somebody wants something in 3 days and you only have such a big staff, and you know, professional issues like that. Not it isn't practicable because maybe powerful people in Congress don't like the answer I'm about to give, and therefore it's not practicable to give a result. We just want to make sure that how you're going to interpret the language you put in the resolution.
Sure. Yeah. No. The extent practicable is to me is really sort of a professional ethics sort of term. It's whether we feel like we can produce an estimate that we think is going to be accurate and we think it's defendable for us. That's really what the only way I'm thinking about that term.
Okay, perhaps one more. Anybody? All right. Well, this gentleman.
I'm Ted Bowl with the Joint Economic Committee staff, and referring to the outlay part, you get political reactions that say, well, you're doing this dynamic analysis only for the tax side because you want lower taxes, and what about the benefits of government spending and so forth. It seems to me that to give a good answer there, you need cost-benefit analysis of the spending. So the individual agencies that are performing and getting funded should be doing appropriate cost-benefit analysis to show that the way they're spending the money is actually generating results where the benefits exceed the costs. And that seems to me is going to be very complicated in an overall macroeconomic analysis. Could you comment on that?
Sure. The way it works now with just any of our scoring, we often call agencies and talk with them about details about how exactly they're going to do what they're being asked to do to help us make these sort of judgments like that. And of course, yeah, it would be helpful, obviously, if agencies already had some work that they could cite, something that they could help us with on that. But that's an interesting issue. I think it's a real one.
Well, I'd like to thank the panel for your participation. I think everybody learned a great deal. Thank the audience for coming. This concludes our event.
Thanks, Dr. Hall. Nicely done.
Thank you. Thank you.
Guys.
Sorry, the slide.
On the next Washington